Welcome back, everyone, to the third Wild Isle lecture of the philosophy of writing. This time we're going to be talking about diction. Audience, are we familiar with the term diction? Anyone knows what that means before we start?
It means writing.
Sort of. It does kind of mean writing. It means choice of words in particular. And that's what this lecture is going to be about, is the particular words you might choose to use. Really, this applies both in writing and in speech, but we'll get into it as we go. Let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, an introduction a bit by Confucius. So I already mentioned we're going to talk about the choice of words. And Confucius has a really famous quote about this. The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper names. What do we think that means? What does it mean to call something by its proper name?
Don't be deceptive.
Yeah, it does mean to not be deceptive, but is deception the only way that you could call something by an improper name?
You could be abstract, not specific.
Abstract, not specific. You could be vague, and vagary might, let's say, conflict with propriety. We'll get into what that means. But then, the question that is begged here is, do things have proper names? Is it even right to say that a thing ought to be called some particular word? We'll get into it as we go. Go into the next slide. All right, so that quote isn't the actual Confucius quote. I found it reading through the Analects, and so I believe it was the Analects is where it is. And so I wanted to give the quote in full. So it's, if names be not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried to success. And actually, this quote's way longer. It goes on for like a whole page. And what Confucius ends up saying is like, well, look, if you, well, I don't want to spoil it, right? So given this, the expansion of this, what is the point that Confucius is actually driving at, right? If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried to success. Is that true? So calling things, do we know? Confucius argues that actually it is the case that this would go all, for him, everything ends up going all the way to the level of statecraft. Actually, all of Chinese philosophy is kind of obsessed with this. But he says essentially it goes all the way up to the emperor or the king, who then fails to administer his laws, let's say, or his will to his ministers, who then fail at their level to their officers, and all the way down the chain until the whole world is living in essentially an illusion of lies, and things just stop working, right? If you're familiar with a little bit of the history of the Soviet Union or Mao's China, that's an example actually of what it looks like if you have a society built on a continuum of lies, where essentially to succeed, you have to, say what the authorities want you to say, whether or not it is the case. And then eventually, you'd say, well, yes, of course, there's food in the store, or the grain stores, and there's not. And then, well, you can see what happens. So we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so that kind of begged the question here, what is the proper use of language then, right? Or perhaps a better way to say it is, what is the proper word to use in a given context? Go on to the next slide, because I think I refined this question a little bit more, right? Yeah, so really the second question, what is the right word to use in a given context, isn't really that great. It's really, what does proper or propriety mean, right? Because you can't answer the question, what's the proper word to use in a given context? I can give you all the contextual information in the world, and you're not going to know what word to use if you don't know what proper means. So before we dig into, let's say, I think it's more Confucius talking about propriety, because that's all he talks about. That's not true. He talks about sincerity too, but a lot about propriety. What do we think propriety means? Proper. Give it a shot. Shot in the dark here.
The whole time you were talking about the last few slides, I was just thinking about, I think there's like a Czech philosopher, Václav Havel, who talked about living within truth. And I was just, I don't know, that's just what I was thinking, like being true to yourself, being true to the world.
Yeah, I like that last bit, true to the world. And what was the philosopher's name?
Vaclav Havel.
Vaclav Havel. I have not heard of him, but yeah, that true to the world or in the world or true to yourself. There's a reference to something external to the words being used or to the truth or falsehood being spoken, right? It's as if these things don't exist in a vacuum and they exist, let's say, in the actual lives that we live. And actually, Confucius here in a second is going to make a case for that. So let's go ahead and see what he has to say. I remember, there he is. Kind of blown up there. So, the steps in the honor due to the worthy are produced by the principle of propriety. He who possesses sincerity is he who, without an effort, hits what is right. Sincerity is that whereby self-completion is effected. Language is a bit thick here, right? So let's go over the bottom part of this quote. What does he mean here when he says, he who possesses sincerity is he who hits what is right, and affects self-completion. This is digging a little bit deeper than, let's say, mere writing. Though, if you're doing any self-reflective writing, journaling, which, to be honest, is what is going to be useful for most people, is going to be writing down your thoughts so that you can see what you thought, rather than believe the gray think that might be buzzing through your head, dream-like, if you remember the first lecture. And if you weren't here for that one, we talked about how when you think, it seems like you're thinking in words and seems like you're thinking in images, but if you think about it, there aren't words and images in your head. Right? Like if you go through your brain, it's a bunch of mush and there's like essentially the equivalent of electric pulses in there. So then what's happening in here, what it seems like isn't. And just like a dream, what seems to be coherent and makes sense, when you wake up and you self-reflect on the dream, it's like, wait a minute, that didn't make any sense at all. Why is it when I was dreaming, I didn't catch all the giant plot holes? Right? So, same thing when you're thinking. If you think your thoughts, let's say, are more coherent than your dreams, try to write them down and see what happens. You'll find that you'll run into a bunch of holes in your own thinking. Well, why does that matter? Well, I went on that giant, what is the word? Is it rabbit hole? Yeah, giant rabbit hole to come back to Confucius here. Right? Because what he's saying is that which is proper is that which is both sincere and it hits on what is right, or it hits the mark, right? If you know about the origins of the word sin, they come from, I believe, the Greek word hamartia, which is an archery term to miss the mark. So you're missing on what is accurate to reality. And what Confucius is saying here is if you use a poor choice of words, right, if you don't use language correctly, you won't even be able to, let's say that you could use the word individuate, but to use a simpler term, you might have heard, have any of you heard of self-actualization? No? We're getting one nod here. Yeah, so if you haven't heard, it's all right. If you haven't heard of it, you don't know what that means, either self-actualization or individuation. It means becoming who you could actually be that would, let's say, enable you to live your life in a meaningful, and Aristotle might say happy way, right? If happiness is the kingdom of ends, right? Because you do everything else you do for another reason, except for happiness. Because once you achieve happiness, it's like, that's the end. You don't do anything after that, right? Like that's what you're going for. And to achieve a good life is to achieve a life of meaning and happiness. And Confucius is saying, well, it's not just if you lie. If you're, like you mentioned, if you're vague, if you don't know what the words you're using mean, right? Then you will be putting obstacles in your way to your own happiness. And you might find that out if you try journaling, right? Let's go ahead to the next slide. We spent a lot of time here on Confucius. All right, so we talked a lot about propriety. We'll go through this quickly. Again, if you're new, I give a vulgar or common. That's what the word vulgar means, by the way, if you didn't know that. And if you recognize the connotation, like we use the word vulgar to mean almost like disgusting, well, it just means common. That also is why, the word average we don't use, but you might be insulted if someone says mediocre. They mean the same thing. Just let that set in for a second while I read this definition of propriety. So most people think is just that which is proper, appropriate, right, correct, something in accordance with manners or politeness. Anyone want to tell me what's wrong with this first definition? Propriety, that which is proper, appropriate. What's wrong with that? Because there's definitely something wrong with that.
It's saying that to be common is appropriate, I guess.
No, it's not saying. I see how you got that. It's not saying what is common is necessarily what's appropriate. But what it is saying is that which is proper. You notice the word appropriate has the word proper in it. It's a conjugation of the word proper, right? So it's saying that which is proper is what is proper, and what is proper. It is not saying anything, right? When I've taught at universities, I've gotten what I'm about to tell you down here is a bunch where they repeat the question you ask them back in like answer form. So it's like I might ask like, why do you like oranges? And they say something like, well, oranges are good. It's like that's what that question was. Of course you think oranges are good. I asked you why. Right? There was no answer. They just looped back the same information and prepackaged it to you. That's called a tautology, right? It's a logical fallacy. It's something that if you aren't familiar with it, or if you're not paying very close attention, someone can just get away with. It sounds like they've said something to you, right? I'm sure when I read this, that which is proper, appropriate, right, or correct, it seemed fine, right? Like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense until you think about it. It's like, wait a minute, I still don't know what proper means. You haven't told me anything, right? Formally, the tautology, this fallacy called a tautology, is when they include the conclusion in their premises, right? If you're not familiar with those terms, premises are the set of reasons you have to an argument that reach a conclusion, like what you think is true, right? But if I have what I think is true assumed already in the premises, you can see that I could do that with anything, and then therefore conclude whatever I want by just making a tautology, right? It's a very clever way of lying. So this is not a good definition for propriety. Let's see if we can find a better one. Go ahead to the next slide. There we go. This is the second definition I always give as usually one that I've constructed that I think is useful. This one, that which is objectively suited to its task or circumstance. Remember I talked about context earlier? This is what I'm getting at. You're in a particular context. There's you have an individual with certain talents and skills. You're maybe around other people who have the same thing. You have certain resources. There's certain cultural norms, historical precedent, people's feelings, whatever. All those things are contextual, bits of contextual information, right? And that which is proper is that which achieves the given purpose, because you have a goal, you're doing something. Like if you're throwing a party, you're trying to have everyone, let's say, enjoy the party, but not enjoy it so much that it wreaks havoc on your house, but also not so that someone gets particularly offended and now you've ruined your friend group, right? Like you have a set of goals, a set of constraints in the context. And that which is proper is that which best fits or best suits those goals. I don't know if I have it included in, I won't say it yet. There's a bit with Aristotle where he talks about what constitutes good that might be in this lecture, so we'll see. If not, I'll throw it in ad lib. So what else do we say? That which applies to the situation best, right? Go ahead to the next slide. So we've got propriety. Okay, so I believed it was in the last lecture we talked about language as cartography, right? What was that about? Do you remember? Language as cartography or map making.
If a map is too big, it's not practical use, I guess is one of the things we talked about.
Yeah. A map can't be perfect. It can't be a one-for-one representation, because then it would have to be literally the size and scope of the real thing to have all the detail. So then you end up losing detail as you get smaller to make a map something you could actually use, something you could carry around. Look, okay, well, I can see this line on the piece of paper, and the line doesn't look anything like an actual road, but I understand this means the road, even if I can't see a bunch of the details of the road, right? And we talked about how that was the basis for scientific thinking, which is important because you kind of have to be a little bit scientifically literate in order to write well. That'll make more sense as we go on. But if we think of it in terms of a scientific model produces maps. It does not tell you precise knowledge. It doesn't give you exact detail. What it does is say, okay, if given context X, Y, and Z, you'll get result A. Like if you set everything up the way that we set it up, in those conditions, then what should happen is what we got. That's a model. It's a map, right? Like, it's not the thing that happened then and there in that particular set in time, but it lets you predict something in the world, right? Just like a map lets you know, if I take this route, I will get to the destination that I'm planning on going. Okay, that's the scientific model. Language is the same thing. When we're using language, whether we're writing or we're speaking, we are, let's say, selecting our words or the construction of our sentences, the particular tone that we're using in order to communicate effectively. The point is, did I correctly encapsulate the reality that I'm trying to describe? So, looks like we have another option here.
I'm so sorry.
No, all right. All right. We had some uninvited guests. So, I'm just going to lock us in there. I might be in the dungeon now. But as I was saying, with language, it's like, okay, well, I need to make sure the word I'm using actually encapsulates what I am intending to what it is, and then that has to be useful to communicate to somebody else, so that my words are both communicable to that person, but also they correspond with some reality, so that you could base predictions in your life on your words, right? Here's an easy one, like if you use the word love, you actually have to know what that means, because if you don't know what that means, then like you might say like I love you to somebody, or I love this thing, or like we're in love. Like you can use all these words, but like, you know, maybe you're a teenager and you're just like infatuated, and or it's like if you've ever read Tom Sawyer, he ends up getting a crush on this little girl, and it ends up being a funny point of the plot where the little girl finds out he had a crush on a different little girl like last week because he's like 10, and so yeah, right. But you know, for him the concept is ill-defined. He thinks, oh, I have these crush-like feelings, that's what love is, and I know all these other things about love I'm supposed to know. I'm going to include them all in the same category because I'm 10 years old and I don't know any better, and then I'm going to go out in the world and act as though I understand my own feelings. You see? Right? The wrong word can completely distort your model of reality. So, let's go to the next slide. Now we need to know a bit about what a concept is, because we've used that word a lot, right? So, I intend to use a lot, because when I say a word, I'm not making a direct reference to a thing, right? So if I say desk, right, but let's say that, or better, let's use desk. There are lots of desk-like objects, but like every table isn't a desk, right? There are some tables that are ill-suited to the purposes, the function, the context in which you would use a desk. But if in my head, let's say, all tables are essentially in the same category as desk, when I go to communicate with people, or even if I go to use those tables, I'm not going to be able to tell that I am misapplying the word, because the concept in my head becomes too broad. I think as we go through the definition specifically, this will become a little clearer, right? So most of the time when people use the word concept, they think, oh, it's just an idea, like a notion, a thought. A better definition to make what I said a little clearer, the concept is the map. It is the model, right? It is the category to which things belong. Why does that matter? Well, let's say, let's carry on with that desk example. Maybe you have one of those like high-end tables that you have to use, like kind of like a bar stool, like high seat to sit at, and you're doing a lot of, I don't know, schoolwork, and the table is kind of small, it doesn't really fit, and like you're sitting there doing it, and like let's say that in your head there's no real difference between tables and desks, and so you're having to cram all these books or constantly take them out. You don't really have enough room. Maybe this particular desk happens to be wet all the time. It's in like a cafe or something, because it's not a desk. It's a table. It's something that people will sit at and have drinks or food. It's not designed for you to use it, let's say, to any utility. Now, that's with a desk. That's perhaps not as fun of an example, but you could see how having a concept or a map that does not correspond with reality can be a problem, right? And so you need a word to map onto that concept correctly. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay. Now, here's a question. What should be encapsulated in the definition of word? Because we're talking about choosing words. Now, there's an obvious problem here because you can't just say, oh, well, I'll just refer to the dictionary, right? Because dictionary will have 7 definitions, they'll contradict each other. We've talked about this before. It's actually not all that useful. So what you need to do is have, let's say, a word that is defined as to, let's say, incorporate concepts only what you want and not what you don't mean. Well, I'll give this metaphor and we'll see if it makes a little more sense. So you imagine a school of fish. Some are edible, some are delicious, others are repugnant, some are poisonous. They all swim in the same school. And you want to catch one of the delicious fish. Well, what do you do and what do you need? Go ahead to the next slide. All right, so you need the right size and shape of net, right? So your conceptual categories must be tight enough that the delicious fish cannot escape, but not so tight that the bitter and poisonous fish get caught at the same time, right? Does that kind of make sense? If you want the holes in the net to catch the fish that you want them to catch, but let's say that the poison fish are smaller, or perhaps one of them are bigger or smaller. I don't want to have to think it through right now. The point is that if you expand it too much, then you start to cause problems. That's our desk and table problem, right? If I incorporate all tables in as desks, then now I'm not paying attention to what desk I'm using. I'm not using a desk. Now I have back pain, right? I'm hunched over the whole time. Let's see. Go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, right. Choosing the right words, the right diction is like that net making. Or if you like, it's like cartography. Now we're going to get into thick and thin language. So we pick a word that is thick enough in terms of its content that it communicates everything we intend, but still thin, not so encompassing that it communicates things we don't. Okay, so I'm going to give some examples of what I mean, right? Because I had the desk and table examples. But this will perhaps make it a little clearer. So thin words. These are words that, let's say, don't contain a whole lot of information. They tend to be, in a sense, hyper-specific. Preferable, right? Desired more than some other thing. Problematic, a source of undesired complication. Unafraid, not in a state of fear. Unsafe, not in a state of safety. Go to the next slide. I think I have more. Okay, so I made thicker or got thicker versions of all those terms. Kind, to treat or be disposed towards someone as of a friendship or kin, right? There's a lot more in that, actually. So if I'm saying, like, well, this person is kind, I'm saying they're treating you like family. And there's a bunch of emotional connotations to that, because as soon as you link into family, it's, well, what is like family like, right? And so what is kindness? Kindness is, it has all these attachments to your experience of, let's say, being treated as one of the tribe or one of the group, the in-group. Wicked, right? A thing done of or in possession of an ill intent. You don't use the word wicked lightly, right? Like that's like something malicious. You think of like a witch when you think of wicked. It's way more than simply problematic, right? Like that's not the same thing. It doesn't make you feel the same way. Courageous, right? That's way more, let's say, evocative than something like unafraid. Even though you might think, well, they mean the same thing. Well, no, they don't. They don't mean the same thing. A virtue, enabling one to overcome fear. One is simply saying you're not in a state of fear. The other is saying you're in possession of a virtue which enables you to overcome something that is a difficulty or an obstacle. And craven, right? A vice of cowardice, an inability to overcome fear. There's like moral judgments in a lot of these. And you'll find that with thick language, it's not just more descriptive, but it's also, let's say, both normative and judgmental. Let's go to the next slide. We'll go through another slew of these. Inexpensive, right? Expensive, right? Cost is not high in price or relatively high price. To run, move quickly or rapidly, rapid locomotion of the legs, really technical sounding, right? Very dry. Say, to articulate words into meaningful sentences. Go to the next slide. Let's look at the thick versions of these. Cheap, right? Think about that. If you said something, oh, well, that your necklace is quite inexpensive, that might even be a compliment. You're not charging me too much. If I say your necklace is cheap, right? I don't even have to give the definition. You can immediately comment low quality or attached to that. Extravagant, same thing. Like you rarely hear that word because it would say excessive, gaudy, right? It's got this overfilling to it. To flee, right? To run or move away. Like run versus flee doesn't mean the same thing, right? When I say, as soon as I say you're fleeing, it imparts intention, purpose. There's more to the word than that. To exclaim, to announce, or speak with exuberance or volume, right? Obviously, that has extra meanings on top of the word say. If you're an author, you end up using a lot of words like that to replace say in your dialogue. All right, so let's go to the next slide, see if I talk about the significance of this. I do. So thin words are vague, broad in scope, clinical, detached. They're useful for universal claims and objective descriptions, whereas thick words are particular, specific, relative to limited conditions, times, peoples, and places. They're useful to describe subjective experiences and cultural perspectives. Let's go ahead through. Now, I'll talk about Descartes and the word perfect here first. I'll keep going. We'll go right through to Descartes because this is the fun part of the lecture where I go through Descartes' use of the word perfect, then I have Nietzsche respond, not very kindly. Then we'll talk about the significance of thick and thick language right at the end. So I'll read through this rather quickly. I apologize, and just try to listen close. See if you can find any problems. Because Descartes makes like a really big error. This is, I call it like the Frenchman's error, and I'll explain why later. Now, it is evident by the natural light of reason that there must be at least as much reality in an efficient and total cause as in the effect of that cause. For I ask, where could the effect get its reality from apart from its cause? And how could the cause give it that reality unless it also possessed it? Go to the next slide. It follows from this that something cannot be made from nothing, and likewise, that something which is more perfect, in other words, that which contains more reality in itself, cannot be made from that which is less perfect. If you're having trouble following Descartes there, this is part of his, let's say, pure rationalist, it's all right. 1,000 blank photos and right. But when Descartes is he's trying to make a rationalist defense for the existence of God, setting aside what he's trying to prove, because that's not really important here. He's trying to do it from a position of pure skepticism. He's saying okay, if I don't know anything and I know that I exist, and he's building on from that. He's making a case that, well, if I exist and I can't come from nothing, then something must have produced me, and that thing must be at least as real as I am. And in fact, it must be, I can imagine a perfect being that could create me, and if it must be more real, then a more perfect being must have more reality in it. Does anyone see a problem with that phrase I just used? Because I even have a hard time saying it. How much reality is in this chair? Does that phrase sound odd to anybody?
I mean, I'd say it's real. You can see it, smell it, touch it.
Yeah, but that question is how much, it's a quantifiable measure, reality.
Uh-huh.
Do we even think of reality as being in degrees? Right? I don't think of things being in degree of real or not. That's a weird way of thinking, isn't it? Also, here's a question. What does the word perfect mean? Yeah, we might use that word a lot, but as soon as you actually try to define what perfect means, you realize, I don't know what that means. I've never known what that means. I've just used it, right? And we're about to see there's a number of mistakes. We go on. I think next is, there's Nietzsche, there's Descartes. Next slide. All right, go to the next one. That was me having a bit of fun. All right. The Nietzschean hammer. By the way, if you didn't know, Nietzsche said he did philosophy with a hammer, meaning that he essentially very quickly and deftly just destroyed everybody else's philosophy up to the point where he existed, which he does actually in a very short amount of pages in Beyond Good and Evil. So anyway, to quote Nietzsche, and he's harder to follow than Descartes, so listen closely. One should not wrongly materialize cause and effect, as the natural philosophers do, according to the prevailing mechanical doltishness, which makes the cause press and push until it effects its end. On the next slide. One should use cause and effect only as pure conceptions, that is to say, conventional fictions for the purpose of designation and mutual understanding, not for explanation. Go to the next one. In being in itself, there is nothing of causal connection, of necessity, or of psychological non-freedom. There, the effect does, or should be, not follow from the cause, sequence, reciprocity, relativity, constraint, number, law, freedom, motive, and purpose. Next slide. And when we interpret and intermix the symbol world as being in itself with things, we act once more as we always have acted, mythologically. Okay, so Nietzsche very verbosely just ripped into essentially the kind of error Descartes was making. He wasn't directly referencing Descartes, though he does a page or so back in the book. Specifically, this last slide really tells us, right? We are interpret and intermix the symbol world as being in itself. What mistake is that? What's the symbol world like that we've already talked about?
Plato's allegory of the cave. Is that what he's talking about now?
He is making reference to that, yes, because that's like when we talk about being in itself. That's definitely the idea of Platonic forms, but or reference to things not being. Well, let's not get into Platonism because it's going to confuse things even more. But think of what is a map but a world of symbols, right? It's a bunch of symbols on a piece of paper. And what Nietzsche is pointing out that Descartes has done is he has mistaken his, let's say, he's used bad definitions to encapsulate poor conceptions that are symbols and thought that the symbols are reality through his argument. Does that make sense? It's like I can come up with a bunch of ideas in my head, and I assume the concepts are on, let's say, the same, have the same validity as reality itself. But then you start to look at it, it's like, well, perfect might not even exist. Just because I could like define it in my head and have this kind of idea about perfection, right? Like a conceit of perfection, it doesn't mean that perfect is real, right? Or that, let's say, whatever conception he has of reality is real. It might kind of touch on what we mean when we say real, but very clearly when we start talking about a thing having more or less reality, it's like, Descartes, you made a mistake, buddy. Like you're using the wrong words, and so your whole argument is built up on nonsense. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so now we get to summarize and tie this all together because we've gone all over the place a little bit. Go ahead. All right, so what this whole lecture has been about is that the words you choose matter, right? The proper use of diction is the same thing as being honest. Improper use is essentially the same thing as being deceptive. Context is king. What that means is context is what determines what is proper, remember? So what is proper is determined by the, let's say, you could go to teleology, like the purpose of whatever that thing is, so whatever is trying to be done. Thin concepts are good to use, or thin words for that matter, are good to use when you're talking about something neutral or objective. So if you look at a scientific journal, or even journalism, they should be using neutral language. They should be using thin terms. They shouldn't be trying to impart feelings into you, right? If they're doing that, someone's trying to get around your reason. And on the other half of that, thick concepts are evocative. They refer to our subjective experience, so like a memoir or fiction. If you have get up here being a motivational speaker, you're trying to get up and have people act. You know, sometimes when I'm giving the lecture, I'm trying to keep your interest, make sure not everyone's falling asleep. I might use thick language at times. That's proper for that, for the purpose. The only time you would argue otherwise is if your purpose was to manipulate somebody, which happens quite a lot. Go ahead to the next slide. So next time, We're going to be talking about the philosophy of grammar. What does that mean? We're going to learn the significance of the subject-predicate relationships. It's actually way more interesting than it sounds. And then we're going to go into understanding how to transition between clauses so as not to lose relational information. That's even more significant to get you guys hyped up for next time. There's a lot of information that you lose when you're trying to communicate with someone if you can't connect the clauses of your sentences, right? There's a huge difference between and but, or and because. They can entirely change what you're saying. Small things like that, small little conjunctions. Let's see. One more slide, I think we have. Yes, this is my call my shill slide. So for those of you watching online, if you don't know, I'm also an author and a freelance editor. So you can find all the stuff at my website, wildiselit.com. I've got a weird fantasy fiction novel, Wand Smoke Broken, that's out now, available on Amazon. You can find it on my website. First chapter is free on there. Give it a listen. It's great. Also, if you've got a manuscript, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, doesn't matter. I do proof reading, line editing, and developmental editing. Shoot me an email through the contact form there if you'd like to hire me for that. With that being said, do we have any questions at all? No? All right, well, thank you guys for coming. See you next time.